V85. You have been lied to by someone you loved, maybe for months, maybe for years, maybe for so long that when the truth finally surfaced, you had to do the math on your own life. What was real? What was performance? What was you, and what was the version of you that existed only inside the lie? And the worst part is not the liar. The worst part is the moment you realize you believed it. You wanted it to be real. You built around it. You made decisions around it. You told other people about it, and they saw your face go bright when you described it. And they believed you too, because you believed yourself so completely. Maybe you already know it. Maybe you only feel it. That quiet pressure behind your eyes at 3 a.m. when something does not add up and your stomach already knows the answer your mind refuses to accept. The discovery of betrayal does not arrive like thunder. It arrives like a slow leak, a word that does not match, a date that is wrong, a door closed 1 second too fast, and then one day the whole floor collapses and you're standing in the rubble of years you thought were real. Saint Teresa of Avila knew this feeling from the inside. Not from a romantic betrayal, but from something older and more devastating. The discovery that the spiritual life she had been constructing for nearly 2 decades had been built on foundations she had never honestly examined. She had been praying without praying, worshiping without surrendering, showing up to the altar while protecting the exact part of herself that the altar required. And she did this for 18 years without knowing it. That is not stupidity. That is how deception works when you are the one doing it to yourself. She spent nearly 20 years inside the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila, Spain, a place she entered at age 20 in 1535, living what she later called a life of comfortable mediocrity disguised as devotion. She did her prayers, she followed the rules, and she allowed herself to be lied to, not by a person, but by her own comfort. When the truth finally broke through, it shattered her. And what she discovered on the other side of that shattering is one of the most useful things any human being has ever written about what happens when the lies you lived by finally collapse. If you find value in documented, historically grounded stories like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work, and drop a comment telling us what city you are tuning in from. This script draws from Teresa's own autobiography, known as The Book of Her Life, written between 1562 and 1565, under the direct instruction of her confessor, Father Garcia de Toledo, as well as from Rowan Williams' 2014 scholarly study, Teresa of Avila, published by Bloomsbury, a work that goes deep into the psychological and theological architecture Teresa built from her own wreckage. Now back to the story. Teresa of Avila was born on March 28, 1515. In Avila, a walled city in central Spain sitting at over 1,100 meters above sea level, one of the highest cities on the Iberian Peninsula, cold and austere and built like a fortress, because for centuries it was one. Her full name was Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda y Ahumada. Her family was wealthy, socially ambitious, church-attending, respectable, and carrying a secret that had shaped everything about how they moved through the world. Her grandfather, Juan Sanchez de Toledo, had been a converso, a Jewish convert to Christianity, who was publicly shamed in a Toledo street procession in 1485 for secretly practicing Jewish rituals. The documentation of that ceremony survives. It is called an auto de fe, an act of faith, which is the name the Inquisition gave to public acts of humiliation and punishment. Juan Sanchez walked through the streets of Toledo wearing the San Benito, a penitential garment marked with the symbols of his crime. In front of a crowd, his children watched, his family watched. Then the family relocated to Avila, changed their social positioning, accumulated property, married into the right circles, and buried the story so deeply that Teresa grew up in a house full of religious imagery and religious practice built partly on the concealment of what her grandfather had actually been. She did not know this growing up. She found out later, and when she did, it reframed everything. The family's religious intensity, the careful performance of old Christian identity, the hunger for respectability that shaped her father Alonso's entire life. The first great lie she had lived inside was not chosen. She inherited it. It was structural. And yet it left a mark on who she became, on her sensitivity to the gap between what is performed and what is real, on her extraordinary nose for self-deception in herself and in the people around her. Her mother died when Teresa was 13. Her father, Alonso, responded by throwing himself into religious reading. Teresa responded by throwing herself into romance novels, and the attention of a cousin whose company made her father nervous enough to send her to the Augustinian convent school of Our Lady of Grace at age 16. She did not want to be a nun. She was vain. She admitted it herself. She enjoyed her hair. She liked the way people looked at her. In chapter 2 of the Book of Her Life, she writes plainly about her attachment to a particular friendship at that school, a relationship she describes as occupied with all the things people generally occupy themselves with in the world, meaning flirtation, gossip, the small performance of being admired. She was ill at 17, sent home to recover, and it was during that recovery that she read the letters of Saint Jerome, the 4th century scholar who translated the Bible into Latin whose prose could make a person feel ashamed of their entire interior life in a single paragraph. Jerome had a gift for violent honesty, and Teresa, burning with fever and vanity and grief, read his words and felt something shift. In 1535, at age 20, she walked into the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation in Avila. She chose it not for its spiritual rigor, but because she had a friend there. Cold fact. She picked her convent the way a person picks their college based on who else is going. The Incarnation in 1535 was not a place of radical poverty. It housed around 180 nuns, and that number matters enormously because the Carmelite rule had originally been written for small desert communities living in silence and severe physical discipline. The rule was composed in the Holy Land in the early 13th century for a handful of hermits on Mount Carmel, men who lived in individual cells and gathered only for Mass. That rule had been adapted twice, softened considerably, and by the time Teresa arrived at the Incarnation in Avila, the community of 180 women was living something that resembled a genteel Catholic social institution, far more than a desert hermitage. The convent had a parlor where nuns received visitors behind a grill and conducted what Teresa honestly describes as extended social performances. Nuns from wealthy families brought servants. They had separate kitchens. The food differed by class. Some nuns spent significant portions of their days in conversation with the city's leading families, performing the role of wise, holy women while internally living lives that Teresa, with her characteristic precision, calls divided. She was one of them. She was extremely good at it. She writes in chapter 7 of the book of her life that she was so attached to her social interactions at the Incarnation that when she had to leave the parlor and return to prayer, something in her resisted. I felt more alive in the company of people, she writes, than alone with God. And she did not frame this as vanity, exactly. She framed it as fear. She was afraid of what she would find if she got truly quiet. Afraid of herself. Afraid of the thing in her interior life that kept trying to get her attention and that she kept drowning out with conversation. She writes about this in chapter 7 of the book of her life with a precision that is almost painful. She describes a period of roughly 18 years from her entry in 1535 to approximately 1554, during which she oscillated between genuine prayer and the complete abandonment of it. She would pray for a time, feel something real, then stop, return to the parlor, the conversations, the stimulation of being admired, then guilt, then prayer again, then distraction, then silence from God, which she interpreted as punishment, and then more withdrawal. She writes that she spent years without being able to pray at all. I did not understand, she says, what was happening to me. She was not lying to God. She was lying to herself about what she actually wanted, and the two felt identical from the inside. In 1539, she became so ill, she nearly died. She lost consciousness for 4 days. The nuns at the Incarnation began preparing her burial. Her father refused to believe she was dead. He kept a candle burning. She regained consciousness, paralyzed on one side, barely able to move. It took 3 years for her to walk again, and even that did not break the pattern. She recovered, resumed the parlor visits, resumed the oscillation, because illness does not automatically produce transformation. What produces transformation is truth, and she was not ready for it yet. The moment that changed everything came in 1554. Teresa was 39 years old. She walked into an oratory, a small prayer room, at the Incarnation, and came face to face with a statue of the wounded Christ. Not a new statue, a statue that had been brought in temporarily for a celebration. She had walked past images of Christ her entire life. This time something was different. She stood and looked at him. And in chapter 9 of the book of her life, she writes, I felt so keenly aware of how poorly I had thanked him for those wounds that I felt my heart break. I threw myself down before him, begging him with tears to give me strength once and for all so that I might not offend him. Scholars, including Carol Slade in her 1995 book, Saint Teresa of Avila, author of A Heroic Life from University of California Press, argue that what happened to Teresa in front of that statue was not a mystical vision, in the technical sense, but something closer to a complete psychological rupture, the moment when a person stops being able to maintain the version of themselves they have been performing, and encounters the raw fact of who they actually are. The lie she had been living, that she was doing enough, that her prayer was real enough, that her divided heart was acceptable, that lie ended in front of a temporary statue on a random afternoon in Avila in 1554. What followed was not peace. And get that out of your head right now. The discovery of a lie, even a lie you have been telling yourself, does not produce immediate clarity. It produces chaos. After 1554, Teresa began experiencing what she called locutions, interior words she heard without hearing, and visions she saw without seeing. Her confessors were alarmed. Several of them told her she was being deceived by the devil. One confessor, a learned Jesuit named Father Juan de Pradanos, initially believed her experiences might be genuine. Another, the harsh Dominican theologian Melchior Cano, declared publicly that her visions were diabolical in origin. Cano was one of the most respected theologians in Spain in 1560, and he was wrong about Teresa, completely wrong. But she did not know that at the time. Think about what that means. She had spent 20 years building a spiritual life, finally cracked open to something real, and the authorities she trusted to help her discern what was happening told her the real thing was the dangerous one, that the genuine encounter was the fraudulent one. The people whose job it was to tell the truth called her truth a lie, and Teresa had to sit with that. She had to keep praying, keep experiencing what she was experiencing, and keep returning to confessors who were divided about whether she was a saint or a demoniac. She was examined by at least 11 different spiritual directors over the course of her life. 11. Some helped, some damaged her badly. A Jesuit named Father Baltazar Alvarez, who directed her spiritual life for 6 years, from 1559 to 1565, believed her experiences were genuine, but was himself under significant institutional pressure from his superiors to restrict her. He required her, at certain points, to resist the prayer states she was entering involuntarily, as if willpower applied to God's visitations was a coherent spiritual strategy. Teresa endured this without entirely breaking, which is extraordinary. She also pushed back in ways she could, by writing, by seeking additional opinion, by building alliances with figures like Father Pedro de Alcantara, who could provide the external validation that her confessors were withholding. The dynamic is recognizable. It is what happens in any relationship where the person with institutional authority over you is either incompetent or afraid, and you know things they do not, and you have to figure out how to navigate the gap without burning the entire relationship down, because you still need the structure even when the structure is failing you. Teresa needed the sacraments. She needed the church's framework. She was not operating outside it. She was trying to get it to understand something it did not yet have the vocabulary for. In 1560, she met Father Pedro de Alcantara, a Franciscan friar who had spent 40 years in extreme physical penance. He reportedly slept only an hour and a half each night for decades on a rough wooden seat in a cell barely large enough to stand up in. Alcantara examined her experiences carefully and told her what he genuinely believed, that the spirit at work in her was of God. He became her defender. He wrote letters on her behalf. He died in 1562, 1 month after Teresa's reformed Carmelite convent of St. Joseph opened in Avila with only 4 nuns, the first of what would eventually become 17 convents she founded across Spain over the next 20 years. But here is where the story about lies and trust becomes something more than biography. Teresa wrote the book of her life not as a spiritual memoir in the comfortable sense. She wrote it because her confessor ordered her to. She wrote it under conditions of surveillance, knowing it would be read by the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition in the 1560s was not an abstraction. It was an active institution that had burned people, and it was paying close attention to women who claimed visionary experiences. Princess Juana of Austria, a powerful figure at the Spanish court, protected Teresa for a period, but protection was never guaranteed. When the book of her life was submitted to the Inquisition in 1575, a decade after she wrote it, Teresa was 60 years old and fully aware that her words might condemn her. She wrote the truth anyway. And that is where the thing about lies becomes something you can actually use. Because Teresa's account of her 18-year oscillation, that agonizing back and forth between real prayer and social performance, is one of the most precise descriptions ever written of what psychologists today call self-deception. Not lying to other people, lying to yourself. And she gives you the exact mechanism. She writes in chapter 8 that she could not bear to be alone with herself. I sought company, she says, as a way of not having to face what I was. The parlor conversations at the Incarnation were not evil. The friendships were not sinful. They were distractions. And the insidious thing about distractions is that they work. They genuinely take your mind off the thing you cannot face. And then you come up for air and find a year has passed, and then a decade, and then you are standing in a room full of people who admire you, and you feel completely hollow, and you do not know why. Subscribe if you have not yet, and tell us what city you are coming from in the comments. This research pulls from Teresa's own hand, from Rowan Williams's deep academic study published by Bloomsbury in 2014, and from Alison Weber's Teresa of Avila and the Rhetoric of Femininity, published by Princeton University Press in 1990. A book that goes into exactly how Teresa navigated writing dangerous truths inside a system designed to silence her. Now back to the story. The Inquisition examined the book of her life and kept it, locked it in a vault. Princess Eboli, a noble who had briefly joined and then dramatically left Teresa's reformed convent after her husband died, reported Teresa's writings to the Inquisition in 1575 out of apparent revenge. The book was confiscated. Teresa did not get it back during her lifetime. She died on October 4th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, in the monastery she had founded there, and the book was still in the Inquisition's possession. She had written it knowing this might happen. The trust she had built with her confessors had been broken multiple times. The system that was supposed to provide spiritual guidance had called her authentic experience diabolical. The woman she had trusted as a close friend, Princess Aboli, had weaponized her most vulnerable writing against her. And Teresa kept going, not because she was indifferent to the betrayals. She felt them deeply. In her letters, and over 450 of them survive, collected in the Biblioteca Nacional de España and carefully indexed, she is often exasperated, often wounded, occasionally furious in the most controlled possible way. She writes to her brother Lorenzo in 1576 that certain people have been spreading lies about her intentions for the Avila Foundation. She writes to Father Gracian, her closest collaborator in the last decade of her life, that the opposition from within the Carmelite order feels like being attacked from inside your own home. That image matters. Being attacked from inside your own home. When the lie comes from outside, you have a perimeter you can defend. When the lie is inside, when the person who shared your table, your prayer, your most private hopes is the source of the wound, there is no clean battlefield. There is only the wreckage of something you thought was mutual. Teresa addresses this directly in the Interior Castle, the work she wrote in 1577. In 2 weeks, she says, in a state of something she could not fully explain, having been ordered to write it by Father Geronimo Gratian, her closest Carmelite collaborator, who recognized that the book of her life was locked in the Inquisition's vault, and the Church needed access to what Teresa had learned. The Interior Castle was the solution, a new map of the same territory, written in more abstract terms that would be harder to pin as heretical. It is also, by any serious literary or psychological standard, a masterwork. It has been read continuously for 450 years. William James cited it in The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902. Edith Stein, the Carmelite martyr who died at Auschwitz in 1942, wrote her doctoral dissertation on Teresa. Thomas Merton read it repeatedly. Contemporary psychologists working in contemplative neuroscience, including researchers at Harvard Divinity School's Mind and Life Institute, use its architectural maps of interiority as frameworks for understanding what happens in the brain during sustained meditation states. The castle has 7 dwelling places. The soul moves through them. And in the third dwelling place, which is where most devout, well-meaning, religiously serious people live their entire lives, Teresa places a very specific trap. She calls it the prayer of those who have not yet surrendered. These are people who do all the right things. They pray, they give alms, they are careful with their speech. They are, from the outside, exemplary. And they are, from the inside, still negotiating, still holding something back, still protected by the performance of virtue from the full force of their own interior reality. The discovery that you have been living in the third dwelling place, thinking you are further in, is Teresa's version of finding out you have been lied to, or rather, that you have been the one doing the lying. And she does not make this soft. She writes that people in the third dwelling place often react to suffering with what looks like acceptance, but is actually a very refined form of complaint. They bear their crosses beautifully in front of others. Alone, they are not so sure. They are afraid of what real surrender would cost. And that fear, dressed in the language of virtue, is the lie that costs the most because it is the hardest to see. You can see a lie someone else tells. You watch for it. You notice inconsistencies. You run the timelines against each other. But the lie you tell yourself is invisible from the inside, because you are the one maintaining the conditions that make it invisible. Teresa had access to 180 other women doing the same thing, which is why she was able to describe it so precisely. She was studying herself and everyone around her for 18 years. Silence. Recognition. The only way out. Now here is the part of this story that cuts the deepest, and it is verified in multiple sources. In 1562, the year Teresa opened St. Joseph's Convent in Avila, she was 51 years old and in constant pain. She suffered from what she described as a noise in her head so loud she could barely hear herself think, which modern medical historians, including Fernando Diaz-Plaja in his study published by the University of Salamanca in 1983, have speculatively associated with tinnitus or possibly a neurological condition related to her near-death episode in 1539. She also suffered from heart pain, nausea, and periodic paralysis in her left arm. She founded 17 convents in 18 years in this condition. She traveled across Spain in wooden carts on roads that in December made her teeth rattle. She negotiated with bishops, with noble families, with hostile priors, with a divided Carmelite order fighting its own reform. And she wrote. She wrote the book of her life. She wrote The Way of Perfection as a direct instruction manual for the nuns of St. Joseph's. Practical, pointed, sometimes funny, in the way that totally exhausted people are funny. She wrote The Interior Castle. She wrote the Book of Foundations, which is essentially the administrative record of her 17 convents, full of specific names, property prices and maravedis, names of benefactors and opponents, travel distances and leagues. It reads like a project manager's notes from the most ambitious startup in 16th century Spain, and she wrote 450 letters to her brother, to her nuns, to kings, to confessors who had betrayed her trust and confessors who had held it. She wrote to Philip II of Spain, Philip II, the king who was simultaneously running an empire and micromanaging the Spanish Inquisition, asking him to protect her reformed convents from the unreformed Carmelites who were trying to dismantle them. She wrote plainly. She did not flatter. She called the opposition what it was. What does any of this have to do with lies that shatter trust? Everything. Because what Teresa discovered across 67 years of living is that the most destructive lie is not the one told by an enemy. It is the one told by a system, a relationship, an institution, or a private habit of mind that you trusted so completely you forgot to examine it. Her family had lied to her about their history, the converso grandfather, the street shame in Toledo in 1485. The Carmelite order she joined had lied to itself about what its rule actually required. Her early confessors had lied, not maliciously, but incompetently, about the nature of her interior life, and she herself had lied for 18 years about how present she was to her own prayer. And the discovery of each of these lies broke her, and the breaking was the point. She writes in chapter 11 of the book of her life that she stopped trying to think her way through prayer. For years, she had tried to use her intellect to reach God, constructing meditations, following schemas, doing everything correctly, and it produced nothing she could trust. The shift happened when she stopped thinking and started simply enduring presence. She calls this the prayer of quiet, a state where the will is held but the mind is still wandering, like a small child who keeps running off but keeps being brought back to the mother's side. Not perfect, not still, just persistently returned. That image of the child is not decoration, it is a technical instruction. Teresa is telling you what to do when your inner life is a mess of contradictions and your trust has been broken by something or someone you depended on. You come back, not because you have resolved it, not because the lie has been undone or the wound has healed or the betrayal has been explained. You come back because the alternative, which is permanent self-protective distance from anything real, costs more than you can actually afford. She applied this to people too. After Princess Eboli reported her book to the Inquisition in 1575, Teresa did not collapse. But let us be precise about who Princess Eboli was, because she is not a minor character in this story. Ana de Mendoza y de la Cerda, Princess of Eboli, was one of the most powerful women in 16th century Spain. She wore a black eye patch over her right eye, damaged in a fencing accident in youth by some accounts, and she moved through the Spanish court at Philip II's side as the wife of Ruy Gomez de Silva, one of the king's most trusted advisors. The Gomez de Silva family had funded the Pastrana Foundation, one of Teresa's convents, in 1569. They had given land, money, and their social credibility. Teresa was grateful. The relationship looked solid. Ruy Gomez died in July of 1573. Eboli came to Pastrana in her grief, put on a habit, and tried to join the community as a nun. She was 43 years old. She was a princess. She had never been told no in any serious way by anyone. The Carmelite convent at Pastrana had 11 nuns, living under a strict rule that made no exceptions for rank or temperament. Within weeks, the community was in chaos. Eboli wanted authority she had not earned, expected deference the rule did not permit, and treated the other nuns with what Teresa's own accounts describe as a fundamental incomprehension of what they were actually doing there. Teresa removed her. Eboli left. She took back the donations she could take back. And then 2 years later, in 1575, she gave the Inquisition a copy of the Book of her life. Teresa was 60 years old and had been through too much to collapse over this specific wound, though it was a serious one. She worked around it. She completed the interior castle in 1577. She continued the foundations. She kept writing to Philip II. She did not reconcile with Princess Eboli. There is no evidence of reconciliation in the historical record, but she also did not allow the betrayal to become the organizing principle of her remaining years. That is different from forgiveness as a sentiment. Teresa was not sentimental. Read her letters. She is pointed, precise, and often strategically cold when the situation calls for it. What she practiced was something more structural. She refused to let the space where trust had broken become the space that defined her. The broken place was real. The loss was real. The lie that had been protected inside that relationship was real. But it was not allowed to become the ceiling. She had a name for what she did instead. She called it detachment, not emotional numbness, not strategic coldness, not the performed indifference of someone pretending not to care. Detachment in Teresa's vocabulary means you are fully present to the reality of what has happened. You see it clearly, you feel it accurately, but you do not allow it to anchor you to a fixed point of pain. You see the wound. You do not build a house on it. She had learned this from the 18-year oscillation. She knew what it meant to organize an interior life around avoidance of something painful. She had done it. She had lived inside it. She was not going to do it again with the Eboli betrayal. She acknowledged it, named it in letters where it was necessary to name it, managed its legal and institutional consequences, and kept moving. In 1580, 2 years before her death, Teresa made the journey to Palencia in January. In January, in a cart, in the cold of the Castilian plateau, to establish a new foundation there. She was 65. She was still in pain. The tinnitus had not stopped. The heart condition had not improved. The Carmelite reform wars had been grinding for a decade and were not fully resolved. Father John of the Cross had been released from his Toledo prison in August of 1578 after 9 months of confinement, having composed some of the most profound spiritual poetry in the Spanish language on scraps of paper he smuggled out of his cell. He emerged half-starved and clarified. This was her closest collaborator in the reform. This was what the opposition had done to him, and Teresa was still moving. She got out of the cart in Palencia, walked into the building, and started talking to the bishop about the terms of the foundation, pragmatic, direct, slightly impatient, fully present. She had 17 foundations to her name by 1580. Each one had a story of opposition, negotiation, property disputes, financial shortfalls, hostile local clergy, difficult personalities, and the constant background noise of a divided religious order that wanted the reform stopped. And each one had opened anyway. She founded the Burgos convent in 1582, the last of her 17. She was 66. She was visibly ill. The negotiations for the Burgos Foundation had been unusually complicated. The Archbishop of Burgos, Cristobal Vela, had initially given permission and then withdrawn it, and Teresa had already traveled to Burgos in January of 1582 and winter before the matter was settled. She spent months managing the Burgos Foundation in a state of physical deterioration she did not conceal from her letters. She writes to Father Gratian in April of 1582 that she is struggling more than she has in years, but adds immediately that the sisters in Burgos are excellent and the house is good and God has given her what she needed for this one as he has for all the others. No self-pity, no summary of grievances, no inventory of what she had been owed and not received. Just the next thing. She died in Alba de Tormes on October 4th, 1582, the night the Gregorian calendar reform took effect across Catholic Europe, eliminating 10 days from the calendar at once, so that she died on October 4th and was buried on October 15th with nothing in between. Even the date of her death is strange and exact and slightly surreal, the way the lives of remarkable people tend to be. And here is what makes the whole story land differently than you expected. When the book of her life was finally released from the Inquisition's vault, it was not released during a moment of triumph or official vindication. It was released in 1688, over 100 years after Teresa wrote it, over 100 years after she died. And scholars examining the manuscript found something they did not expect. Sections had been annotated. Someone, possibly a reader inside the Inquisition itself, had underlined passages about the prayer of quiet, had marked the section about the wounded Christ in the 1554 rupture, had drawn small marks in the margins beside her descriptions of the third dwelling place, the comfortable, self-protecting, deeply religious life that is still not quite honest. Someone in the institution that confiscated the book to determine if it was dangerous had apparently been reading it to figure out what was wrong with their own interior life. The Inquisitor's annotator, whoever they were, their name is not recorded, their rank is not preserved in the colophon, had underlined the sentence where Teresa describes 18 years of partial prayer and written in the margin, in 16th or 17th century Castilian script, a single word. The transcription of that word, examined by scholars at the Escorial Library where the manuscript was housed before its transfer to the Royal Archive, is rendered in modern Spanish as Yo también. The translation is, me too. The lie that the institution held locked in a vault for over 100 years was already doing its work from the inside. The truth does not wait for permission to matter. It works on whoever encounters it, even when they are the ones who confiscated it, even when they are the ones who called it dangerous, even when they are sitting in judgment over the woman who wrote it in pain on a cold night in Avila in 1563 with the Inquisition already watching, and her confessor ordering her to go deeper into the truth she was most afraid of. She went anyway. She wrote it anyway. She handed it over anyway. The last sentence she is reliably reported to have said, according to witnesses at her deathbed in Alba de Tormes, recorded in the testimony of the nun Ana de San Bartolome, who held her head in the final hours, was this: Lord, I am a daughter of the Church. Not a summary, not a comfort, not a settling of scores, a statement of where she had landed after all of it, after the family secret buried under respectability in Avila, after the 18 years of oscillation between real prayer and the performance of it, after the confessors who got it wrong and the inquisitors who locked her words away, After the friend who used her book as a weapon, after the convent wars and the cold January roads in carts that rattled her bones for 2 decades, after the noise in her head that never fully stopped, a daughter of the institution that had, at various points, called her authentic experience diabolical, confiscated her life's most honest work, and imprisoned her closest collaborator for 9 months in a 10-foot cell, she claimed it anyway, not because the institution had earned unconditional loyalty, but because she had decided that the truth she carried was large enough to hold the broken parts without being defined by them. The annotator inside the Inquisition's vault had read her words in secret and written "Me Too" in the margin of the very book that had been seized to silence her. That is the last fact. That is the thing that reframes everything. The lie does not get to keep the territory it occupied. Even when it succeeds in the short term, even when it locks the truth in a vault for 100 years, the truth finds its reader. It always finds its reader. Cold, vault, margin, me too.